At 10:45 p.m. on a warm July evening in Los Angeles, the financial district was alive with its usual late-night rhythm. The hum of traffic echoed through the concrete canyons. Delivery drivers zoomed by with packages for office towers, and city workers wrapped up their shifts, eager to head home. Among the shadows of this vibrant urban scene, a man in a worn maintenance uniform wheeled a battered trash bag toward the unassuming service exit of a Wells Fargo branch. He moved with purpose but without haste, blending seamlessly into the bustle. No one spared him a second glance. But what none of them knew was that this man, Joseph Joe Carter, wasn't a maintenance worker. He wasn't even employed. He was homeless, a forgotten figure on the fringes of society, someone the city's bright lights and relentless pace had long since passed by. And inside that seemingly unremarkable trash bag wasn't garbage. It was $2.8 million in cash. This wasn't a scene from a Hollywood heist thriller, though it could easily be mistaken for one. It wasn't a plotline from the latest Netflix true crime documentary either. This was real, and Joe Carter wasn't the criminal mastermind you'd expect to see at the center of such a story. There were no high-tech gadgets, no team of operatives waiting in the wings, no elaborate blueprints scrawled on whiteboards. Joe was a man forged by the fires of hardship and shaped by life's relentless cruelty, a survivor whose story was as layered and complex as the streets he walked every day. To understand how a man like Joe, someone society had rendered invisible, managed to pull off one of the boldest heists in LA's history, we have to step back to before the heist, before he became a ghost, before his name became a whispered legend among the city's underbelly. To truly understand Joe Carter, we need to explore the journey that led him here, a journey filled with pain, resilience, and choices that blurred the lines between right and wrong. Joe's story wasn't just about the $2.8 million he wheeled out of that bank. It was about a life defined by struggle, redemption, and the desperate lengths a man can go to when he feels he has nothing left to lose. To truly grasp the magnitude of what Joe did that night, we must first uncover the events that transformed him from an ordinary boy growing up in South Central Los Angeles into the ghost of the financial district, an unlikely figure who would change lives in ways no one could have predicted. Joseph Carter was born in 1972 in the heart of South Central Los Angeles, a neighborhood known for its vibrant culture but also for its harsh realities. The city was a patchwork of opportunity and despair, and Joe's childhood teetered precariously between the two. His mother, Gloria, was a tireless worker, juggling two jobs, one as a cleaner in an office building, and the other as a cashier at a local grocery store. Her efforts kept the family afloat, but just barely. His father, James, was another story. A man of grand promises but fleeting presence, James drifted in and out of their lives, leaving behind memories of arguments that echoed through their small apartment, and birthday promises that were rarely fulfilled. For young Joe, his mother was a symbol of resilience. He often stayed up late waiting for her to come home, her uniform stained from hours of labor. She'd collapse into a chair too exhausted to eat, and Joe would quietly bring her a glass of water. Despite her fatigue, Gloria always found time to encourage Joe, telling him he was destined for something greater than their circumstances. Those words stayed with him, even as the world around him seemed intent on proving otherwise. At school, Joe showed promise. Teachers described him as curious and sharp, a boy who always asked questions that went beyond the lesson plan. He wasn't just intelligent, he was resourceful, finding ways to solve problems that others overlooked. But life in South Central was as unforgiving as it was unpredictable. By the time Joe turned 12, his neighborhood was ravaged by the crack epidemic of the 1980s. Every block had its corners, every corner its unspoken rules, and every day brought new challenges. Friends he had grown up with began disappearing, some into gangs, others into the juvenile justice system. Joe's life took its first major turn at 14. It wasn't hunger that drove him to steal snacks from a convenience store, but a dare from older kids in the neighborhood. The act itself was small, almost trivial, but the arrest left an indelible mark on his psyche. Though he wasn't sent to juvenile detention, Joe began to see himself differently, not as the bright, ambitious boy his teachers saw, but as a statistic in a system that seemed rigged against kids like him. That one theft became a gateway to larger crimes. By the time Joe was 16, he was running errands for older boys in the neighborhood, ferrying stolen goods or acting as a lookout during break-ins. By 18, he was part of a small-time crew dabbling in car theft and petty fraud. It wasn't about getting rich, Joe would later admit in an interview. It was about surviving. When you grow up with nothing, you learn to make something out of anything. In 1992, at the age of 20, Joe's string of petty crimes escalated. He and his crew began targeting ATMs, using sledgehammers and crowbars to break open machines and steal the cash inside. It wasn't glamorous work. It was loud, messy, and risky, but it provided a steady income. That is, until it didn't. Joe was arrested during a late-night heist and sentenced to 10 years at the California Institution for Men. Prison was a harsh awakening. The physical confinement was one thing, but the mental toll was another. Joe used his time behind bars to reflect, to read, and to learn. He earned his GED and took correspondence courses in psychology, a subject that fascinated him. He devoured books about human behavior, often drawing connections between his own life and the theories he studied. "You come out of there with two choices," Joe later said. "You either stay in the cycle, or you fight like hell to break it." When Joe was released in 2002, he vowed to leave his criminal past behind. For a time, it seemed like he would succeed. He found work as a janitor for a commercial cleaning company and saved enough to rent a small studio apartment in East LA. It was modest, but it was his. He spent his days working and his nights reading, dreaming of a life far removed from the streets that had shaped him. But society has a way of reminding people like Joe of their place. The stigma of his criminal record followed him everywhere. Promotions at work were out of reach, landlords hesitated to rent to him, and relationships were strained by the constant undercurrent of judgment. He tried to push forward, clinging to the fragile stability he had built. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit Los Angeles hard, and Joe was one of its many casualties. His cleaning company downsized, and Joe found himself out of work. The bills piled up, the rent went unpaid, and before long, Joe lost his apartment. The fragile stability he had fought so hard to achieve crumbled overnight. For the next decade, Joe drifted. He slept in shelters when there was room, under bridges when there wasn't. He ate at soup kitchens and rummaged through trash bins for anything salvageable. The streets became his home, and the gleaming skyscrapers of LA's financial district became a constant backdrop to his struggles. It was here, in the shadow of those towers, symbols of wealth and power, that the seeds of his fateful heist were unknowingly planted. Joe had become a ghost in the city that had shaped him, an invisible man navigating a world that rarely acknowledged his existence. Yet even in this bleak existence, he remained observant, taking in the patterns, the routines, and the vulnerabilities of a system that seemed untouchable. Little did anyone know, Joe Carter was about to touch it in a way that no one could have predicted. By 2018, Joe Carter had become a ghost haunting the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles. To the world around him, he was just another faceless figure wrapped in a worn jacket, moving through the patchwork of alleys, benches, and food kitchens that formed his reality. Days blurred into nights, punctuated only by the search for shelter, food, or warmth. Yet Joe wasn't like most of the people society overlooked. He was observant, always watching, always calculating. Where others saw chaos, Joe saw patterns. "You'd be amazed at what people overlook," he once told a shelter worker during one of his rare moments of openness. "When you're invisible, the world shows you its secrets." Those words stuck with the worker long after Joe had shuffled away. He had a presence about him, quiet but sharp, as though his mind was always a few steps ahead of his circumstances. Joe's invisibility, while a symbol of his struggles, had become an unintentional advantage. He moved through the city unnoticed, picking up on the rhythms and routines of a world that didn't know he existed. Delivery drivers unloading packages at all hours, office workers taking smoke breaks in back alleys, and janitors wheeling trash bins to service exits. These were the details Joe absorbed with quiet intensity. It was during one of these quiet nights while rummaging through recyclables near a dumpster behind a corporate high-rise that Joe's life took an unexpected turn. Among the usual discarded coffee cups, crumpled paper, and scraps of food, something stood out: a leather briefcase, scuffed but intact, propped awkwardly against the dumpster. At first, Joe hesitated. The briefcase didn't belong in this setting. It was too pristine, too deliberate. But curiosity got the better of him. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching and pulled the briefcase toward him, its weight suggesting it held something more than just papers. Carefully, he clicked open the latches. Inside, he found folders stuffed with documents, scattered papers bearing the logos of a financial institution, and most intriguingly, a Wells Fargo employee badge. The name on the badge read Richard Avery, and alongside it was a photograph of a clean-cut man in his mid-40s. Joe turned the badge over and found a handwritten code scrawled on the back. Buried beneath the folders was another item that made Joe pause: a small, laminated card listing various access credentials. Joe's heart raced, not from fear but from the weight of possibility. What was this doing here? Discarded in an alley? Had someone dropped it by mistake? Or was it deliberately abandoned? His mind buzzed with questions, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a lucky find. It felt like fate. Unlike the impulsive teenager he had once been, Joe didn't act right away. He knew better than to rush into something without understanding the risks. He spent days mulling over the briefcase's contents, hiding it in a makeshift storage spot beneath a bridge. During the day, he wandered the city as usual, but his thoughts always circled back to the badge and credentials. Was this a chance, a test, or a trap? To someone like Joe, the briefcase was more than just an object. It represented the glaring inequalities he saw every day. Skyscrapers that reached into the heavens, where millions changed hands in mere seconds, stood mere blocks from tent-lined streets filled with people fighting for scraps. To the wealthy, the badge was a tool, a symbol of access and opportunity. To Joe, it was something far greater. It was a key. He couldn't ignore the significance of what he'd found. The briefcase wasn't just a random occurrence. It felt like the universe had handed him an opportunity to tip the scales, if only for a fleeting moment. But tipping the scales came with risks. The thought of failure loomed large, as did the moral conflict of what he was considering. Joe had spent years trying to leave his past behind, but the temptation of the briefcase was undeniable. As the days passed, Joe began to plan. He studied the badge, the codes, and the documents, piecing together their potential significance. He observed the corporate high-rise where he had found the briefcase, learning the comings and goings of its staff. Through it all, he wrestled with his conscience. Was this his chance to strike back at a system that had left him behind, or would it be the final act that defined him as a man unable to escape his past? For Joe, the briefcase wasn't just a fluke. It was a crossroads. The question wasn't just whether he would act, but what kind of man he would become in the process. In the days following his discovery of the briefcase, Joe began laying the groundwork for what would become the most daring act of his life. The Wells Fargo branch wasn't just another bank. It was a fortress of modern security, strategically located in the heart of downtown LA's financial district. Its exterior was a sleek combination of glass and steel, with cameras dotting every corner and uniformed security guards patrolling the entrances. This was a place built to inspire confidence in its clients and instill fear in anyone foolish enough to consider breaking in. From his inconspicuous vantage point near the bus terminal, Joe became a quiet observer of the building's daily rhythms. He watched how employees entered and exited, taking note of the times they came and went. He studied the cleaning crew, timing their schedule down to the minute. He even tracked the guards' patrol routes, memorizing when and where they paused. Every detail, no matter how small, was committed to memory. But Joe wasn't just planning a heist. He was crafting a performance. He knew that to pull this off, he couldn't simply rely on luck or brute force. He needed to become someone else entirely, someone who belonged in that building and wouldn't arouse suspicion. Using his keen eye and a little ingenuity, Joe began to assemble his disguise. From an alleyway behind a hotel, he salvaged a mop and an old bucket. A thrift store yielded a worn pair of khaki pants and a button-down shirt. He added a tattered blue work vest he found discarded near a warehouse. The ensemble wasn't perfect, but that was the point. It was just realistic enough to pass as the uniform of an after-hours maintenance worker. Joe didn't stop at the clothes. He practiced walking with purpose, mimicking the hurried but focused gait of the janitors he had observed. He rehearsed subtle gestures, like adjusting the mop in his cart or glancing at his watch, all designed to make him blend seamlessly into the environment. He even muttered lines under his breath, perfecting his tone in case anyone stopped him. "Sorry, just here to clean up a spill," or "Maintenance, got a work order for the break room." For Joe, this wasn't just a crime. It was survival dressed as audacity. Every movement, every detail had to be convincing because the stakes couldn't be higher. If he was caught, there would be no leniency. He was an ex-con, a man society had already deemed irredeemable, and the system wouldn't hesitate to throw him away for good. Yet as meticulously as Joe planned, his internal conflict grew. He hadn't committed a crime in over 15 years. The life he had tried to rebuild, the quiet stability he had clawed his way toward, seemed to unravel with each step of this plan. Memories of his time in prison haunted him, the cold cells, the constant tension, and the weight of losing a decade of his life. He had vowed never to return to that world, to prove to himself that he could be better than the man he once was. But the world hadn't been kind to Joe Carter. For every step forward he tried to take, it seemed the ground beneath him crumbled, pulling him back into the pit he'd fought so hard to escape. The gnawing hunger he felt every day wasn't just physical. It was a deep, aching reminder of how far he had fallen. And it wasn't just his hunger that drove him. Images of families huddled in shelters, of children clutching threadbare blankets, of mothers queuing for food they could barely stomach. All of it spurred him on. Joe justified his actions as a way to fight back, not for himself, but for those the system had left behind. If he could tip the scales even briefly, perhaps it would all be worth it. Finally, on the night of July 20th, 2018, Joe was ready. As the city lights flickered and the streets emptied of their daytime crowds, he stood in his makeshift uniform, mop in hand and trash bag in his cart. His heart pounded as he approached the Wells Fargo building, the weight of his plan pressing down on him. Every detail had been accounted for, every risk considered, but there were no guarantees. With a deep breath, Joe pushed open the service door he had observed for weeks. As the lock clicked behind him, sealing him inside the building, his mind sharpened. There was no turning back now. Joe Carter was about to make his move. The night of the heist was eerily quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The usual hum of downtown Los Angeles seemed subdued, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic breaking the silence. Joe stood in the shadows near the alley, dressed in his makeshift maintenance uniform, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but now that it was here, the weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him. At exactly 10 p.m., Joe watched from his hiding spot as the cleaning crew exited the building. The janitors chatted casually, their laughter echoing through the narrow alleyway as they loaded their supplies into a waiting van. Joe stayed motionless, his body tense, waiting for the perfect moment. When the van finally pulled away, he emerged, wheeling his battered cart toward the service door he had been studying for weeks. The door clicked open easily with the credentials he had taken from the briefcase. As he stepped inside, the cool, climate-controlled air hit him, a stark contrast to the humid summer night outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, illuminating the pristine marble hallways in stark white. Joe moved cautiously but deliberately, his cart squeaking faintly with each step. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The hum of the building's electrical systems, the distant chatter of a few late-working employees, and the soft scuff of his shoes against the polished floor all seemed to echo louder than they should. Joe forced himself to stay calm, to breathe evenly. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Ahead of him loomed the vault, a towering monolithic door reinforced with steel and protected by a keypad and biometric scanner. Joe's plan hinged on this moment. He pushed his cart past the vault, veering into the adjacent manager's office. Here, his preparation paid off. The office was exactly as he had envisioned from his reconnaissance. A desk cluttered with papers, a computer screen still glowing in sleep mode, and a drawer that slid open smoothly when Joe used the small key he had found attached to Avery's badge. Inside, he discovered a key card and a handwritten note with partial access codes, a small detail that confirmed Avery had been writing reminders to himself. Piecing together the codes from the briefcase documents, Joe returned to the vault door. He swiped the key card and entered the digits with steady hands. Each beep of the keypad sounded deafening in the silence, but the green light finally blinked, and the heavy door unlocked with a low mechanical whir. Inside the vault was a gleaming shrine to wealth. Cold metallic shelves lined the walls, each holding neatly stacked bundles of cash bound with paper straps. The air smelled faintly of ink and steel, and the harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the polished surfaces. For a moment Joe stood there, taking it all in. This wasn't just money. It was a symbol of everything he had been denied. Joe snapped back to reality and began methodically loading the cash into his trash bag. He worked quickly but carefully, ensuring the shelves still appeared untouched. He didn't take everything, just enough to fill the bag without making it obvious that anything was missing. $2.8 million. He had counted it in his head, calculating the weight and space with the precision of someone who couldn't afford an error. With the bag full, Joe retraced his steps. Every movement was deliberate, every turn rehearsed. He avoided eye contact with the few security cameras he passed, keeping his face angled downward. To the cameras, he would appear as just another maintenance worker finishing a late-night task. As he approached the service door, his pulse quickened. The air outside was still warm, the sounds of the city a distant hum. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the alley, the cool night breeze brushing against his face. By 11:15 p.m., Joe was wheeling his cart down the alleyway, his garbage bag securely tucked inside. He moved with practiced calm, blending seamlessly into the night. The bag, though heavy, didn't draw attention. To anyone watching, he was just another worker finishing his shift. He turned a corner and disappeared into the maze of side streets that made up downtown L.A. The heist was complete, and Joe had left behind a scene so meticulously untouched that no one would suspect a thing. It wasn't until the following afternoon, when bank employees accessed the vault, that the theft was discovered. But by then, Joe Carter was long gone, another invisible figure in a city that had never noticed him to begin with. The following day, the city was abuzz with a story that seemed pulled straight from a Hollywood script. News of the audacious heist at Wells Fargo spread quickly, dominating headlines and becoming the topic of every conversation in downtown Los Angeles. How had someone managed to breach such a secure location without leaving so much as a fingerprint? Theories ranged from insider help to a team of professional criminals executing a meticulously planned operation. Speculation grew wilder with each retelling. Some imagined international thieves using cutting-edge technology, while others thought it could be the work of a rogue employee seeking revenge. One detail everyone agreed on was this: whoever had pulled it off was a ghost. Surveillance footage showed nothing more than a shadowy figure in a maintenance uniform, blending in and out of view like a phantom. No one suspected the truth, that the mastermind behind the $2.8 million theft was a homeless man with nothing to lose and everything to gain. But for Joe Carter, the heist wasn't a reason to celebrate. There were no stolen moments of triumph or self-congratulation. Instead, Joe felt a quiet sense of resolve, as though he had simply completed a task that needed to be done. That evening, as the city buzzed with theories about the heist, Joe slipped through the streets unnoticed, carrying the trash bag filled with cash. His destination was a nondescript building, its modest facade masking the importance of the work done within. It was a local shelter, one of many scattered throughout Los Angeles, serving families teetering on the edge of despair. Joe had been to this shelter before. He knew its halls, its faces, its mission. He had seen the tired eyes of parents trying to shield their children from the harshness of the world, and the hollowed-out expressions of people who had long since given up hope. Under the cover of darkness, Joe approached the shelter's back door. The alley was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Carefully, he set the trash bag down against the doorframe. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. This was his moment of decision. Did he walk away, leaving the cash to speak for itself, or did he stay to explain? Ultimately, Joe chose silence. He had no words for what he had done, no grand explanation for the act. He wasn't looking for recognition or redemption. He wasn't a hero. He was simply a man trying to level the playing field, if only for a brief moment. With one last glance at the shelter, Joe disappeared into the shadows of the city, blending seamlessly into its fabric as he always did. The following morning, the shelter staff made a discovery that left them speechless. By the back door was a large trash bag, and inside was an unimaginable fortune. $2.8 million in cash, bundled neatly. There was no note, no explanation, just the money. For a moment, they wondered if it was some kind of mistake or perhaps a prank. But as they counted the bills, the reality of what they were holding began to sink in. Word of the mysterious donation spread quickly among the staff and residents. Questions swirled. Who could have left such a staggering amount of money? Was it a wealthy philanthropist? A guilt-ridden criminal? Theories abounded, but no one could pinpoint the source. Police were eventually contacted, but their investigation turned up no leads. While some suspected a link between the heist and the donation, there was no definitive evidence to connect the two. For Joe, the act wasn't about clearing his conscience or seeking forgiveness for his crime. It wasn't even about the money itself. It was about what the money represented. To Joe, it was a symbol of the vast chasm between the world of the wealthy and the world of the forgotten. For years, he had walked past skyscrapers where millions changed hands in the blink of an eye, all while sleeping under bridges and eating scraps from garbage bins. This act, in his mind, was a way to shift the balance, if only for a fleeting moment. The shelter's residents and staff would never know the identity of their mysterious benefactor, but they would feel his impact for years to come. The money transformed the shelter's operations, allowing them to expand their services, provide meals, and create programs to help families find stability. A playground was built for children, and a small medical clinic opened its doors. Lives were changed, and futures were rebuilt, all because of a single anonymous act. And Joe Carter? He remained a ghost, watching from the edges of a city that never noticed him in the first place. For him, the heist wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by his past mistakes, but by the quiet rebellion of a man who dared to rewrite his own narrative. Joe Carter's story became an urban legend in L.A., a Robin Hood tale whispered in shelters and alleyways. Police never caught him, and the money left at the shelter changed countless lives. But Joe remained a ghost, blending back into the shadows of the city. Was he a criminal? A savior? Perhaps both. What's certain is that Joe Carter, the man who once believed wealth was a shield against life's instability, became something far more complex. A symbol of resilience, desperation, and the fine line between survival and morality. By the time the shelter staff found the bag of cash on the morning of July 21, 2018, Joe Carter was already miles away, weaving through Los Angeles' labyrinth of alleys and side streets. He hadn't planned for the aftermath. His mind was consumed by one driving thought: to disappear. The media frenzy following the discovery was immediate and relentless. The shelter, which had long operated on shoestring donations, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Reporters swarmed the area, speculating about the mysterious benefactor. Was it a philanthropic gesture from a wealthy donor? A drug deal gone wrong? No one connected the dots to a man like Joe, a homeless figure who walked invisibly through the same streets as the shelter's beneficiaries. Joe, meanwhile, was trying to reconcile his own actions. He had pulled off a crime that rivaled Hollywood's most elaborate heist films, but he didn't feel victorious. Guilt gnawed at him, not for the theft itself, but for what it represented. In Joe's mind, His action was an act of rebellion against a system that had failed him and countless others. Yet the weight of his choices bore down heavily. He hadn't just stolen money. He had crossed a line he'd sworn to leave behind. The man who had spent years avoiding his old life was now a fugitive again. The hunt for the mysterious thief quickly gained traction, sparking one of the most perplexing investigations in recent LAPD history. A $2.8 million heist executed in plain sight with no alarms tripped, no forensic evidence, and no immediate suspects. It was a case that baffled even the most seasoned detectives. Within hours of the theft's discovery, law enforcement descended upon the Wells Fargo branch, determined to piece together how such a breach could occur. At first glance, the heist bore all the hallmarks of professional criminals. The precision, the clean execution, and the complete lack of physical evidence suggested a team of highly skilled individuals. Detectives combed through the crime scene meticulously, dusting for fingerprints, analyzing entry points, and reviewing vault logs. Yet the more they searched, the clearer it became that the culprit had left nothing behind. Not even a single hair or a smudge on the vault door. The investigation turned to the building's extensive security system. Detectives pored over hours of surveillance footage, focusing on the night of the heist. What they eventually found was unexpected. A single figure dressed in a maintenance uniform calmly wheeling a trash bag out of the building. The footage was grainy, the camera angles unhelpful, and the uniform's logo, if there even was one, was indiscernible. What struck investigators most was the demeanor of the individual. There was no rushing, no hesitation, no glances over the shoulder. Whoever this was, they moved with the confidence of someone who belonged, as though they were simply doing their job. The more detectives watched, the more it became clear that this wasn't an impulsive act. It was deliberate. This wasn't random, LAPD Detective Marcus Rios told reporters during a press conference. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the building's operations, the staff routines, and the security protocols. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was planned. Detectives began piecing together a timeline, hoping to understand how the thief gained such intimate knowledge of the bank. Their first major lead came from the badge and credentials found discarded in the manager's office. These belonged to Richard Avery, a mid-level bank manager who became the immediate focus of the investigation. Avery's explanation was, at best, suspicious. He claimed to have lost his briefcase several days before the heist while running errands downtown. Detectives found the timing of his admission convenient, as it aligned perfectly with the crime. Avery, however, maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no idea who had taken his belongings or how they had been used to access the vault. Law enforcement questioned Avery for hours, scrutinizing his financial records, personal communications, and daily routines. Was he a willing accomplice, or simply a careless employee whose lapse in judgment had given the thief an opening? Despite their suspicions, detectives found no direct evidence linking Avery to the crime. As the investigation continued, the case grew more convoluted. The meticulousness of the heist clashed with the simplicity of its execution. The idea that a single person, posing as a maintenance worker, could infiltrate a secure facility and escape undetected seemed almost too audacious to be true. Yet the footage showed exactly that. Theories ran rampant within the task force. Some believed the thief had insider help, possibly from multiple employees who had access to key systems. Others suggested it could be the work of a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. But as the days stretched into weeks, every lead seemed to fizzle out. Detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that this was the work of someone entirely unexpected, an outsider who had somehow gained access to the inner workings of the bank. But who could possess such knowledge without leaving a trail? Frustration mounted as the case hit a wall. For all the resources devoted to solving the heist, there was no clear suspect, no smoking gun, and no definitive answers. The media frenzy surrounding the crime began to wane, but for the detectives on the case, the unanswered questions loomed large. Behind the scenes, Detective Rios found himself obsessing over the footage of the figure in the maintenance uniform. There was something about the way they moved, something unassuming yet purposeful. It wasn't the walk of a seasoned criminal or a professional thief. It was the walk of someone accustomed to being overlooked, someone who knew how to move through the world without drawing attention. It's like they disappeared into thin air, Rios later said, reflecting on the case. Whoever did this, they knew how to stay invisible. As the investigation stalled, the mystery deepened. While the task force began reallocating resources to other pressing cases, one nagging truth remained. The $2.8 million was gone, and so was the thief. What no one realized was that the person they were searching for wasn't a professional or an insider. It was a man who had been invisible to the city long before the heist ever took place. Joe, in the meantime, found refuge in the one place no one would think to look, the outskirts of the city. He had made his way to an industrial zone near Long Beach, where vacant warehouses and shipping containers provided temporary shelter. There, he stayed out of sight, blending in with the city's transient population. But Joe wasn't idle. He spent his time reflecting on what his life had become and what his actions meant, not just for him, but for the people he had tried to help. In the weeks that followed, the shelter staff began to see the tangible effects of Joe's anonymous donation. The $2.8 million allowed them to expand their services, providing meals, beds, and resources to hundreds of families. A playground was built for children, and a medical clinic was opened to offer free care to those in need. For Joe, this was the only solace he found. Though he didn't dare return to the shelter, he occasionally ventured close enough to see the changes he had made. "I didn't want the money," he would later admit. "I just wanted it to mean something." By late 2018, the story of the mysterious heist began to fade from headlines. With no solid leads, the investigation went cold, relegated to a file on a shelf in the LAPD's Financial Crimes Division. But Joe's life remained anything but stable. As the months passed, the isolation of his new existence began to take its toll. He missed the camaraderie of the shelters, the familiarity of downtown, yet he knew returning meant risking capture. The turning point came in December 2018, when Joe heard whispers of a plan to name the shelter's new playground after its anonymous donor. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had stolen millions was being celebrated as a hero, even though no one knew his name. Joe faced a choice: remain a ghost or risk everything to see the legacy of his actions firsthand. By December 2018, the shelter had become a beacon of hope in a city where such stories were rare. The $2.8 million donation had transformed not just the shelter itself, but the lives of those it served. The new playground buzzed with the laughter of children, while the clinic provided care to people who had nowhere else to turn. Inside the shelter's walls, the staff and residents alike whispered about the mysterious benefactor who had made it all possible. The announcement of the playground's dedication brought a media resurgence. The shelter's director, Maria Vasquez, revealed plans to unveil the Gift of Hope playground during a public ceremony on Christmas Eve. It was a symbolic moment, meant to honor not just the anonymous donor but the resilience of the homeless community. For Joe, hearing about the dedication stirred something deep within him. In the months since the heist, he had wrestled with his choices, both the crime itself and the anonymity that had shielded him from its consequences. The playground was a tangible representation of what he had wanted to achieve, but the recognition came with an unshakable irony. Joe's decision to attend the dedication was fraught with risk. Returning to the shelter meant entering a space filled with people who might recognize him, including law enforcement officers who were likely monitoring the event. But for Joe, the need to witness the impact of his actions outweighed his fear of being caught. On Christmas Eve, he arrived at the shelter just before the ceremony began. He had taken great care to alter his appearance, shaving his beard, wearing clean secondhand clothes, and donning a baseball cap pulled low over his face. From a distance, he blended in with the crowd of supporters, volunteers, and shelter residents. As Maria Vasquez took the stage to address the gathering, Joe positioned himself near the back. He watched as she spoke about the transformative power of the anonymous donation, her voice steady but emotional. "This playground," she said, gesturing to the brightly colored equipment behind her, "is more than just a place for children to play. It's a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in our darkest moments there are people willing to make a difference. The crowd erupted in applause, but Joe's eyes were fixed on the playground. Children ran and climbed with abandon, their laughter cutting through the crisp December air. For the first time since the heist, Joe felt a sense of peace. Unbeknownst to Joe, his presence hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Detective Marcus Rios, who had been assigned to the case months earlier, was among the attendees. Though the investigation had stalled, Rios had remained intrigued by the heist's meticulous execution. From the corner of his eye, Rios noticed a man standing apart from the crowd, his posture tense despite the festive atmosphere. Something about the man struck him, a familiarity he couldn't immediately place. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Rios decided to follow the man. Joe, sensing he had lingered too long, slipped away from the shelter and into a nearby alley, but Rios was close behind, his instincts on high alert. The confrontation was quiet, almost anticlimactic. "You've got a hell of a story to tell, don't you?" Rios said as he approached. Joe froze, his heart pounding. He didn't deny it. Instead, he turned to face Rios, his expression a mixture of resignation and defiance. "It wasn't for me," he said simply. Rios studied him for a long moment, the weight of the case and the man before him settling heavily. "You know I can't just let you walk away," he said finally. Joe nodded. "I know." Joe Carter's arrest didn't unfold as a spectacle. It was quiet and subdued, just like the man himself. But news of his capture reignited public interest in the case. As details of the heist emerged, so did the complexities of Joe's story. A man who had taken millions but given it all away. The trial that followed was as much a character study as it was a legal proceeding. Joe's public defender framed him as a product of systemic failures, a man who had acted out of desperation but with altruistic intent. Prosecutors, however, argued that his actions, no matter how noble the outcome, were still a crime. In the end, Joe was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The judge, acknowledging the unique circumstances, called it a punishment tempered with understanding. Today, Joe Carter remains a polarizing figure, a criminal to some, a hero to others. The shelter he helped transform continues to serve hundreds of families, a living testament to the power of his actions. And though Joe's story is one of contradiction, it leaves us with a question: what defines a man? His mistakes or the good he tries to do in their wake? Joe Carter's story challenges us to reflect on the complexities of human nature, morality, and survival. Was he a hero, a criminal, or something in between? What would you have done in his shoes? If this story captivated you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking true crime stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective.